Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Autograde Podcast. My name is Daniel Lugo. I'm your host, and today I have Nancy Deyo, and I think it's going to be a wonderful conversation today. So please take out your notebooks or anything you'd like to write on so that we can start learning. And Nancy, can you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Yes, thanks, Daniel. Good to be here. Hello, everybody out there. I'm Nancy. I'm a former Silicon Valley CEO, and my life got turned upside down. And I went from being an executive and a wife and an athlete to a chronic pain patient, period, full stop. And I really look forward to talking to you about that journey and hope that some of the insights will help any of you out there who are struggling.
Sounds great. So let's get started. So you just mentioned that you were a Silicon Valley CEO and you deal with a 15-year journey of dealing with chronic pain. How did the high performance culture mindset of pushing through limits initially impact how you handle your injury?
That's such a great question. I was definitely pulled into that high performance culture. I was very ambitious. I measured myself on metrics and quarterly goals and measured everybody else that way and thought that I could succeed by pushing harder and outrunning, outlasting anybody else. And the curious thing about that is you think I would have learned how to tame that characteristic in my business, but I didn't. It was exhausting, it was stressful, and when our company ran short on cash, I was close to collapse, and I sold the business to my arch rival, which was a real disappointment for me and somewhat of a failure. And I decided that the way that I was gonna come back was to climb the highest mountain in Africa, which is Mount Kilimanjaro. And it was gonna be my redemption. It's how I was gonna prove that I could still succeed and still achieve and perform in this culture based on productivity. And so I set out to climb the mountain, and I really honestly, despite being an athlete, had no business climbing the mountain in the first place because in my training, I had already injured my back running on a broken elliptical machine. And I decided I was gonna climb anyway because I was used to compartmentalizing my pain and overriding it and figured I could make it anyway. I was tough. So I set out to climb the mountain, and by the time I got up to 16,000 feet, I couldn't sit. I had a duct tape and an inflatable pillow strapped around my body like a back brace, and I couldn't carry my own pack. And I decided that I unfortunately couldn't make the summit because the next day, the last day, was gonna be the hardest one, and I was either gonna get really, really badly injured or hurt somebody on the team. And so I just started to descend with 2 porters who unfortunately didn't speak any English, they only spoke Swahili, and within an hour, I'd collapsed and was just face down in the dirt, and they carried me, and we made camp that night, and at midnight, I remember waking up at 16,000 feet in this tiny tent. I was 41 years old. I was by myself, and I couldn't move my legs. They just felt disconnected from my body, and I felt like when I tried to shift that somebody was driving a steel rod through my spine, so the pain was just unbearable, and I had 2 thoughts. I thought, number 1, this could be it. I might be bleeding out, and I might end up with my name on a plaque like a lot of climbers who don't make it down the mountains that they climb. And the second thought I had was my whole life has been structured around pushing through, pushing harder, and it is not working for me. It's really caused me harm. And you would think that I would learn right in that moment that maybe the habit and the strategy I'd used in business wasn't gonna work to fix what was happening, but it took me 15 years to realize that resilience isn't necessarily about pushing harder, it's about finding a different way to live, and that was the incident that careened me into 15 years of chronic pain.
Wow. Ma- Because, you know, being able, no, not being able, being close to death is something that I have experience with. I went through one of my surgeries and I almost died in that one. And once get close to death, you get to rewire your brain all around it because everything changes for everyone. But I wanted to ask you, what do you mean that resilience changed for you? Because for me, at least to this day, it's still about pushing past my limits. But I just wanted to grasp that what your thoughts are after that experience.
Well, I think for me, resilience used to be about coming back, bouncing back, and about pushing through. And in my case, what I learned was for my body, that started to cause harm. The harder I tried, the more setbacks I would have, the more the pain escalated. And I realized that I had to respect my body's limits, that it wasn't the way that it used to be, and that this shift might be something that's permanent. At the time, I really thought it was. I never thought I could recover. And I realized that I had to work and adapt and kind of recalibrate within what I could actually do.
I see. But, you know, a constant question in my head is if I'm doing enough or if I'm, you know, still behind, I'm not pushing more. So how do we as because I like to think of myself as a high performer, right? How do we know that we are not pushing too hard and that we're pushing enough?
I think there's a definite balance there. And I had to learn very much by trial and error how much was enough because sometimes with the body that I ended up getting after this injury, sitting for 10 minutes too long could create a flare up that would send me to bed for weeks. The pain was really out of control, and the only way that I could manage that was by lying down all the time. Sitting was too painful. So, I think sometimes still persevering can be a very worthy goal, but you just have to do it in a slightly different way that respects what your body is telling you about your pain and what your mind can handle.
I agree with that. I think it's important because if you are pushing too hard and you are injuring yourself more, you're not actually doing anything. You're making things worse. And
Yeah.
I put myself there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a crazy story. About 5 years into the journey, I was spending my life lying down. I was completely dependent on fentanyl, and I really thought there was no future. The person I used to be was left way behind. And the doctors had pretty much fixed what was wrong with my back through surgeries, through 3 surgeries, in fact. And I decided that the thing that I needed to do as a last ditch effort was to go to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and they had a 3-week rapid, pain rehab and drug detox program. And the curious thing about the program is that they pushed so hard. Everybody in that program was really pushed to their limit. And in the first week, they pull you off all the drugs, and we can talk about that later, but withdrawal is a really real and frightening experience, and anybody who's gone through it knows what it does to your body, what it does to you neurologically, and what it does to you physically to be pulled off drugs and not titrated very carefully under, um, strict doctor's observation. But that happened in the first week, and in the second 2 weeks, they tried to force back physical function, so I went in there lying down on the conference room floor because I couldn't sit, and in 2 weeks, they had me sitting, just gritting my teeth through, pushing to sit longer and walk further and start to do the activities of daily living. And at the end of it, I thought I was starting to be successful, and I remember calling my doctor and saying, I think I might get my life back. I can see the inkling of what used to be." And he was very metered and very conservative and said, "I'll see you when you get home." And I thought I was kinda pissed off. I thought, "Why isn't he happy for me? I mean,
Hmm.
I've made so much progress." But he was right, and I got home, and a day or 2 later, I had crashed and landed in the hospital for intractable pain and put on more opioids than ever before. And I think what I realized is that in the Mayo Clinic's program, for me, it was too much too fast. They pushed me so hard, and that was my nature, so I pushed myself. And I remember the doctor coming into the room in the hospital and saying, "We ran a bunch of new tests, and there's just nothing structurally wrong with you. We can't find anything. We will try to help you with your pain, but we need to discharge you." And on that day, my husband went looking for nursing homes to put me in. And, this is for a 40 something person. That was not the place for me, but he could not care for me at home. I was too weak and dependent and in too much pain to have a person who wasn't a medical professional managing my care. And at that moment, I thought, "Oh my gosh, this everything that I've based my life on is now hurting me. And pushing hard is causing me, it's harmed my body. And I need to find a way back that uses a different approach that focuses on the good and what I can do and what my physical limits are and respecting that." And in a way, I felt on my own, but I had to find a way forward because, like you, I was still determined. I had that high performance gene in my body that didn't want to quit, but I just had to do it in a different way.
I like that. In your bio, you mentioned that your life no longer responds to effort the way it once did, like you were just speaking about. For high achievers who believe that any problem can be solved with enough hard work, what is the hardest truth they have to accept when life forces a sudden stop?
I think there are a few things. I think that they will they may realize that this striving, high achieving, pushing hard mentality at some point or another is going to catch up to their body and to their mind, either through physical ailment or stress or a complete breakdown or needing to change jobs or leave what they're doing. I also think that it changes the way that you lead. And I think there are a lot of people out there in your community who are probably leaders in their companies, in management positions, and they cannot hold everybody up to that standard. I mean, it takes listening. Sometimes it takes realizing that being open and maybe even a bit vulnerable about your condition is going to create a collaborative and empathic environment, and that there is a way forward that isn't always just about metrics and achieving the next goal.
I think that's important because often we are too focused on numbers. And then once we look at those numbers, we might think that we have to push harder, but that pushing harder is making your body take a toll. And your body doesn't tell you that in the moment. It takes some time to do that. So most people view resilience as bouncing back to who they were before. Your experience suggests it's more about reconstructing a completely new identity from scratch. What does true adaptation rebuilding look like when there is no going back to the old version of yourself?
I think the first thing that needs to happen in rebuilding is you can't hold on to that person that you used to be. You got to let it go. And that's really hard. That was hard for me because I liked who I was and I liked my life. I thought it was pretty great being able to run a company and travel and have friends and do things spontaneously and achieve great things. I think the second thing is not fighting what's real, not fighting reality. I had to learn to accept what for me in my body was a new normal. And that was a life that looked really different. It was one that was lived mostly horizontally. That's not the way that, all of us get through life, and that's not the way that we present ourselves out in the world. It's a pretty unusual thing to come across somebody who is so, disabled that they can't sit. So that presented some real challenges, but what I realized in the rebuilding was that my brain was fine, and I could still think, I could still learn, I could still make decisions, I could maybe still help people. So, the decision that I made in rebuilding was that I wanted to get back in the world because I had been a shut-in for over a decade, mostly in my bedroom in horrible pain, unable to really walk, unable to sit, unable to participate in any normal activities of daily life, and certainly not able to run a company. So, the decision that I made was to go back to grad school, and I first applied and got in and thought, "I'm gonna defer because I can't sit yet, and I have no idea how I'm gonna go to school." I mean, I had this purpose in mind, I was gonna rebuild that way, I was gonna pivot my career a little bit from technology to, trying to lift up other people, particularly girls and women, and I ended up realizing that if I waited until my body would allow me to be, quote, "normal," I was gonna wait forever. And so I decided to just re-enter the world horizontally, and I went back to grad school, but I was lying down in the middle of class on an army cot because that was the way that I could function. I felt okay if I was horizontal, and I could still use my brain and still go to class, so that's what I did. And that was a really key step in rebuilding because I realized that I wasn't defined by my disability. I was a person who just happened to present in the world in a different way.
I think you hit a really important point, which is looking at a bigger picture. Even though you have chronic pain and you're not able to sit up, you took a look at, I was like, my brain is still functioning. I can still do this. I can still do this stuff. For me, I went to Crohn's disease. Even though I was not able to eat the same as everybody else, I could do things normally. But when we focus on the things that we can't do, we're gonna live a life that is on the limit. We're not able to do things. But if we look at things and we look at the bigger picture, okay, I'm going through this, but I'm still able to do a lot of these things. Wow, how that changes the perspective of how you look at life, and you live a more positive life after that.
It's more I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's more about recognizing where there's still a lot of possibility, and instead of focusing on what you can't do, you focus on what you can do, and you just know what your guardrails are. Mine happened to be that I just really couldn't function and sit.
How can people learn to distinguish between healthy adaptation and dangerous perfectionism? Because I'm a perfectionist myself.
Wow, I am the classic. I should say I was. I'm reformed. I mean, if I've learned anything through this roller coaster about ambition and collapse and recovery, perfection for me was a trap because as a real high achiever, my perfectionism was relentlessly striving for goals that were unattainable. I mean, I thought I needed to be smarter, funnier, younger, better, uh, you name it, the next level up in my career. And I think it's why teenage girls starve themselves to look like a Barbie doll. I think it's why ambitious entrepreneurs go from startup to startup looking for the brass ring. I just think perfection, the hard thing is it's in a way it's not attainable. And it can be a little bit destructive because if something breaks, you fall apart and it links your identity to performance and it ties your self-worth to performance. So if you can't perform, it's not just failure, it's complete meltdown. So for me, I learned that resilience wasn't about getting it right, wasn't about being perfect for sure. It's about like, how do you stand up on 2 feet when things go wrong? How do you stay intact?
And it's about trying because you're gonna fail. That's for certain. We're not gonna be right 100% of the time. We
And
are.
for
We are.
sure, if 9 out of 10 startups fail, the ones that people talk about are the one that succeeds, not the other 9, and I think the real lessons and the insight come from the 9
The
that
other
didn't
9.
make it, if we're open to learning from it.
Yeah, and that goes into my next question. Why do you think the actual process of survival and healing is often much messier than the polished things that we see in social media?
Oh, okay. Social media. Well, first of all, survival for me was not this clean victory. It was humbling. It was really painful and it was a mess. I mean, I was a CEO, I was an athlete, I was a wife, I had a career, I had friends, I had like the dream husband. And I survived the failure of my startup. I survived the failure of Kilimanjaro, but my life was just upended in such a way that it was reduced to a walker and a bedside commode and a husband who became a caregiver and a cocktail of drugs on a side table. And I think, survival sometimes looks like a comeback or a victory, and it looks like your life might be getting smaller, not bigger, but there's just not a clean ending. It's not my beautiful life that is portrayed on social media in many cases. It's living in the middle of the mess and surviving it, and for me, it was like staying present inside a body that might never be what it once was. And, part of the reason that I ended up writing the memoir that I did was because I feel like people portray survival as triumph. And I just don't think that's telling the truth about what sometimes it takes to survive. It's a struggle. And I think that if we're honest about it, people will not feel so alone when they have pain or when they have loss or when they have anything that disrupts their life.
I agree, but at the same time, I will argue, I will give this counterpoint that we should see it as a triumph for ourselves, at least, right? Because when we go through it, and I know you did, and I did, I see it as a triumph because I didn't give in, right? One of the things that you mentioned was that you were dependent on opioids. I was so afraid of that. I was so afraid of because I'm 22, but at the time I was 18.
Oh
I
my.
was so afraid that I would fall into the opioids because I was in pain.
Yeah.
But I see it as a triumph because I didn't. I'm doing this podcast with you right now. I'm not dependent on drugs. So I think you are right in the point of saying we should be honest about how we went through it and the struggles because everybody will see, okay, they went through sort of similar, and that's why I do this podcast, right? But at the same time, I see the perspective of, it should be a triumph because you didn't fall in the trap.
I think that's a really, really fair point, Daniel. I think that anybody who doesn't give up is triumphing.
So many people take their life, and looking at the numbers, you're gonna see that it should be a triumph. It's like if a startup 9 out of 10 fail and the one succeed, that one doesn't have to feel like they didn't succeed because it triumphed over the other 9. They survived and they are in business. I studied business, right? So looking at that and thinking of as a triumph, I think I'm being honest because we had to do both sides. We had to be honest
Absolutely.
about how we went through it, and we had to be glad that we succeeded. And that goes into my next question, I just mentioned that you went through navigating opioids, and I almost, I didn't want to say it, but I got close, right? What is something about that physical and psychological battle that the general public completely misunderstands?
Oh gosh, I have so much heart for anybody that struggles with an opioid use disorder because opioids, there it's not just that they relieve pain, but they teach your body that it can't function without them. And when I went through that rapid detox at the Mayo Clinic partway through my recovery, it was like somebody had ripped a Band-Aid off a raw wound. And, physically you're nauseous and you can't sleep and your nerves are on edge and every sound is amplified. And, I would say the emotional impact is just as nasty as the physical one. And they work really well at first, but tolerance builds and dependence comes very quickly, and suddenly you're not taking them to feel better, you're taking them to keep from feeling worse. And I think that breaking this cycle is it's so much more difficult than anybody realizes, and the relapse rates for opioids are as high as 60%. And that's frightening. I mean, that happened to me. I came home from the Mayo Clinic clean. I was just euphoric about not being on opioids anymore, and I ended up on more than ever before, and it took me until year 15 to get off the drugs once and for all. So I think people need to realize that it's a physiological battle and have some compassion for people that end up by no choice of their own necessarily on these drugs for pain that's just insufferable. And, I applaud you, Daniel, for not heading in that direction because that takes some real fortitude and strength and I wasn't strong enough to be able to withstand it. And in fact, my first opioid came right after I was carried down the mountain. A famous mountain climber who was filming an IMAX movie on Kilimanjaro gave me 2 Vicodin, and that was the start of it. And I was so grateful at the time because I didn't know how I was gonna get to a hospital. And the Vicodin, you know, dulled the jagged edges, but it's such a slippery slope that it's really terrifying. And I think that if you haven't experienced it, you can look at it and feel like you might be better than that. But, I think all of us are susceptible to that downhill battle.
Yes, we are. We are susceptible. I was almost there, and thank you for those words, and I commend you for coming off of them because it's hard
Yeah,
to get into them, but it's also even harder to come out of them. But I do not put that on me because I what I see is by the grace of God I didn't. Because I remember that they had me on morphine, and they had, I think this is pretty stupid. I said this before in the podcast, but they gave me a button that I could press, and every 10 minutes I could get a dose of morphine. And I was in so much pain that I was just clicking. And even though I wasn't getting the dose, I was clicking. And I vomited and I vomited again. And by the grace of God, I didn't fall into them. But I was so afraid. So one of the points for this podcast is for people to see ahead because we have gone through w- this before. So for them to see, okay, yes, they are tentative, like they are there. They're gonna make you feel better for now. Right. But you have to be conscious that you cannot fall into them because if you do, it's gonna be a longer battle to get off of them. And sometimes that battle is not winnable.
absolutely. There's even some evidence, some recent research that shows if you are taking opioids before your surgery, you are less likely to have a positive outcome than somebody who was not on opioids before they got operated on. And it doesn't mean the surgery wasn't necessarily successful. It means that you may have chronic pain that continues, and that happened to me. And the pain became a disease in and of itself, which I think is recognized as such by the medical community today, but it wasn't at the time that I first got sick.
Before we end the podcast, I wanted to ask you this question. What does acceptance mean to you today? Is it a form of giving up, or is it an ultimate starting point for a new way forward?
I love that question. As somebody that had chronic pain, and you appreciate this, I know we think that we have a couple of choices. We think we can fight and we think we can surrender, but acceptance is different from both of those. And, after my injury turned my life upside down and I was forced to live lying down, I engaged with with a therapist, a psychotherapist, and she kept talking to me for years about this idea of the new normal, which to me was this horizontal, monochromatic life and nothing like the person that I used to be. And I always used to say to her, I hate that term. I hate that. Don't use that. I'm not going to do that. And she said, you know what? It does not mean giving up. It just means giving in and stopping the fight with yourself. So acceptance to me doesn't mean I like what's happening. It just means I'm not gonna fight reality, and it means that I can have a really crappy day, and I'm not gonna label it a failure. It means being in your body the way it is, whatever it is at the present moment with if you have pain, if you have limits, you're not overrunning it. You're not trying to override it, because if you don't fight yourself, you have more energy to adapt and build around what you can do, which we've been talking about through this podcast. So it allows you to create a mindset that lets you move forward.
I think that's a great way to end the podcast. Nancy, where can people find you?
Well, if they want to follow my writing, they should follow me on Substack and Nancy Deyo. That's DEYO.substack.com. I have a publication called Life Inside Pain, where I write about all of these experiences with the things, the insights in the hope that it will help other people. They can also follow me on my website and write to me there at nancydeyo.com, or find me on social media where I am present and trying to still be honest and tell the truth.
Okay, that's great. I will leave the link for all your links down in the description so that people can follow you. You can follow me as well on social media at Dugo official. And if you need us, you can contact each one of us. I think each one of us is looking forward to helping you in some kind of way. That's what we're here for. So once again, thank you, Nancy, for coming here and speaking to us about your journey and what you learned. Thank you for the audience for being here. Subscribe, like, and share with the people that you love so we can keep spreading this message. May God bless you all. Take care.